Welcome once again to Minds Between Languages. This episode will consist in a conversation with Professor Ricardo Muñoz, who will share his insights on the past, present, and future of cognitive translation studies. Well, welcome, Ricardo. It's a pleasure to have you here to talk a little bit about the past, present, and future of cognitive translation and interpreting studies. So let's get started right away. Let's talk a little bit about the past of the field, okay? And let's profit from your vast experience and knowledge of this topic. What would you say was the reason for the very emergence of cognitive research on translation and interpreting?
Um, um, Good afternoon. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Adolfo, for having me. There are two different lines here that I think we should mention. First, in interpreting and then in translation. Translation has been a minor topic in language departments, language and literature departments for centuries. But it really became a university discipline when simultaneous interpreting called the attention of the growing field of psycholinguistics. That was in the 60s.
Right.
They were interested in cognitive architecture rather than in interpreting by itself, but they actually paved the way for cognitive interpreting studies. Meanwhile, in translation, there was machine translation,
Right.
and they were trying really hard to make machines translate until the ALPAC report literally killed the funding in the United States and recommended that people would study how humans translate. So the ALPAC report is actually the birth certificate of cognitive translation studies and at the same time of translation studies as a university discipline.
Fantastic. And what's interesting also is that perhaps you singled out the birth of cognitive interpreting studies and cognitive translation studies. Perhaps the overlapping time is somewhat clear or partial between those two trends, but geographically, we're talking about two different worlds, right?
Indeed. Great Britain, Austria, France were studying interpreting, while the United States, Finland, and Germany were studying translation. They were actually very different trends. They did get in contact through the Leipzig school. Otto Kade, the vice director, was an interpreter himself, but his first dissertation on in a university on translation was on translation, not on interpreting. It has taken a long, it has taken several decades, but I think we're finally converging into what we can call now cognitive translation and interpreting studies.
Several decades, you say, and I think it would be fair to say that it's let's say nearing the 6 decades now, right? And with this in mind, if you go back to the 60s, the very onset of the field in these strands that you identified, what would you say were the main hits and the main shortcomings of those pioneering trends? What was the good and the ugly, let's say?
Yeah, well, there were plenty of both, as you can imagine, in every budding discipline taking its first steps. I think the Leipzig School managed to make room for a university discipline different from literature and culture studies. That was actually a major landmark.
Right.
Then it also brought about some mistaken choices, like putting aside natural translation, that is non-professional translation, represented in the concept of natural translation by Professor Diane Harris, who was literally ignored for decades until he has recently been vindicated. I also think that we had great scholars leading the way, like Wolfram Wils, Hans Hönig, but we also paid a high price because we didn't distance ourselves from linguistics.
Right.
Even now, we are often seen as a minor satellite of language and literary studies. And if you think of it, we are at the core of everything we know about language and communication. But we are much more than that.
Right.
We actually exceed current disciplinary boundaries.
Definitely. And you know, I guess so. We are temporarily located in a given decade or set of decades, to identify the let's say the takeoff phase of the field. But now we can, with all certainty, say that we are in a contemporary phase, which is different from the pioneering one. What would you say was the breaking point? If you have to say, this is where the tables turned and we reached a new, maybe not a new paradigm, but a new phase, a new stage in the way in which these fields have evolved and continue to evolve.
Yeah, I think it has to do with paradigms, as you're saying. And I think people like dates. I like dates as they're very symbolic. I think that you could tell that the contemporary stage in cognitive translation studies started at the 7th Psychology Forum in Millersburg, Ohio in 1995.
Was that Wednesday?
Sorry?
Was that a Wednesday, Ricardo?
Actually, it was near the weekend, so Friday. But there, Gregory Shreve invited Barbara Moser-Messer, Danielle Gill, Don Kirley, but also Annette Envy de Groot, and also Bruce Diamond. So it was the first time that people interested in neuroscience, in psychology, in psycholinguistics, in interpreting and translation got together with Greg Shreve, who by training was an anthropologist. So that was really the second welcome to interdisciplinarity that brought us here, I think.
Nice, nice. So again, it would be fair to say that we are now in the midst or at some point in the development of this contemporary stage, perhaps. One could get a little bit more scrupulous with the periodization of the discipline, but we don't need to get into that level of detail. In any case, what would you say are the main goals of the field as it has reconfigured itself now?
Well, there's a basic goal that we all share, that we have always shared, and that we will probably share in the future. We want to explain how people translate, how people interpret. And that necessarily has at least one of the answers has to be cognitive. Then the goals depend on, further goals depend on personal positions or priorities. To me, for people working on cognitive translatology, it is improving training, improving quality of the product, improving the working conditions of translators and interpreters, and not only other professional profiles. For other people, it is more important to try to reproduce translation abilities and skills in machines, or at least developing machines that will support human translators and interpreters, which is fine. We all agree. It's just a matter of priorities, I think.
What's interesting about the priorities that you mentioned is that perhaps running counter to what a number of scholars and people who may be newcomers or even outsiders to the field may entertain. I mean, all of these goals that you mentioned, they were pretty much applied or translational in nature, right? You did not focus on theoretical goals, let's say understanding, description, explanation, and perhaps prediction of translation or interpreting behavior. What would you say is the role or the space for this particular aim?
Well, that needs some elaboration. Cognitive translation studies is an applied science. As such, the object of study is socially defined. I mean, if you're a geologist, you study stones, stones are right there. You can just have a look at them. But if you're going to study translation, you need to define translation, to define where you're going to study, what your goals are, and that is much more difficult. And we are interdisciplinary by nature because we exist to fulfill a goal that is socially defined, like improving the quality of translation. Um, and because of that, we will build theory building upon neighboring disciplines. Um, we can have our own theory frameworks, and I think I'm known rather in that area. Uh, but it is also true that we take many of our basic lines of thought from other disciplines, and it should be so. Just think that having a language isolated, language theory isolated from what psychologists think language is, what anthropologists think communication is, or what sociologists think about the role of language in society wouldn't simply make sense.
Absolutely. But it's interesting, right? Because this idea that the borrowing of disciplinary insights or methods or theoretical notions, somehow I get the feeling sometimes that it is presented as something that undermines the field, or that it does a disservice to the autonomy of the field. You don't seem to believe that, right? I mean, you see this as either perhaps a natural consequence of the very goals of the field, or perhaps is it something that just applies to all disciplines to a different degree?
Yes, exactly. First, I don't need to be told that what I'm doing is interesting. I know it.
All right,
I don't,
fair enough.
you know. On the other hand, I wonder, could any discipline survive today without relying on other disciplines? The disciplinary map was designed at the end of the 19th century. There were no cars, no planes. The first bulbs were being installed in public places. We had no penicillin. There was no TV, no phone, no internet, no nothing. Well, of course, there was a society, uh, um, but it was certainly different to the one that we're living in today. The newspaper had, I think it was The Guardian, had an article on bridging chemistry and biology to face the challenge of COVID-19. For Christ's sake, I mean, we had biochemistry as when I was a child already. I mean, did somebody miss it? It's not my field, but
Right.
there 50 years ago. Um,
Absolutely.
so cognitive science exists since the 60s, and nobody seems to have noticed. I'm honestly not too concerned about this. I'm interested in learning and not in putting fences and labels on the things I learn.
Yeah, in fact, there's that tension, sometimes, because institutions or grant schemes or national science councils and things like that, they do have their commissions, right, and their
Mm.
areas of specialty, and sometimes they are defined in a very outdated fashion, and it's hard for not for to say that someone is doing interdisciplinary work nowadays within the field of science. It's basically saying nothing. It's like that could apply to some degree to most people I know of, irrespective of what their training has been, right? But it's interesting to see that in translation studies, we are at the very least aware of how much we are bringing in from other fields. But my question to you, Ricardo, is: do you think that this is also working in the other direction? Do you think that other disciplines are capitalizing on what the work that we do here has to offer?
Well, it is much more what they take from us than what we take from them. It is true that constructs, conceptual frameworks have been borrowed mainly from psychology, linguistics, and cognitive science, but it is also true that everything we know about language is because it is different in another language. So we learn it through translation. And everything we know about basic architecture of the mind. I'm talking now about constructs rather. It is because in extreme situations such as those provided by activities such as translation and interpreting, gives you the clue to normal behavior. It has been a tradition in the social sciences that not so normal behavior, not so mainstream behavior, sheds light on regularities. So yes, now in neuroscience, as you know very well, bilingualism and multilingualism and different tasks are actually shedding light on many aspects I wouldn't dare name, but I think one of them is rest state, is one of the buzzwords now that may be very interesting when bilinguals and trained bilinguals are the focus to study, right?
Right, definitely. And so it's not to go into one sub area in particular, and profiting from your overarching, your panoptic understanding of the field. If you had to single out, maybe two or three of the key findings, the core contributions that cognitive trends have offered to our holistic understanding of translation, across disciplines. What do you think are the highlights of the work that we do here in this field?
Um, it is difficult to reply that because, of course, you're so close that you see many things, and the trees don't let you see the forest. But I would say that realizing that there's no such thing as a mental lexicon, learning that all communication is multimodal, and language does not exist by itself in a vacuum, knowing that what we assumed to belong to either oral or written language communication forms were actually clusters, behavioral clusters, that now can be split into different things thanks to the internet and telecommunication technologies, has actually changed a lot the way we think about translation. Of course, the whole tools that we have developed in the last 30 years have changed not only the way we look at translation, but translation itself. I mean, I learned how to translate with print dictionaries and portable typewriters. I would not be able to translate that way any longer.
You used to light a candle at nighttime to translate, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's pretty much so. Yeah.
All right, and something, speaking about technologies and devices proper, and how they play, a role in the way in which we conceive of the human mind, and the back and forth that you can see there from. I've read some of the work that you've produced regarding the computer metaphor of the mind and how it may impinge on how we think about translation, how we do research on translation, how we interpret findings from experiments on translation. Do you think that we have surpassed, overcome the computer metaphor of the mind now in the year 2020? Should we? Have we done it partially? Is it something desirable?
Well, some of us have. Some of us think differently. I do not think that having just a way of looking at things is good in any discipline.
Agreed.
I think interaction, competition, healthy competition is extremely good. I also think that opposing frameworks often are wrong, and you can always learn from the others. But yes, I think that we are slowly opening up to different ways of thinking. So far, the mindless computer metaphor has been pretty much the only show in town. And now I think we can watch very different movies.
And so, what was wrong about that movie? I mean, what were the scenes that we should at least be on the lookout for? What would you say? Really, what were the real limitations that came from that? Not to say that we should, really abandon entirely the whole contributions that may have come from them, but what were the real problems? Those things that we cannot escape.
Okay, you can think, in many Latin Romance language countries, you have this label of philologist, which is basically language and literary studies together. So let's call them philologists. It exists also in English. A philologist is somebody who will sell you a car. They will tell you how nice it is, how it looks, how trendy, and details about its beauty inside and outside. Then you have a linguist, and the linguist will open up the hood and tell you how it works. They will even design motors. And then you have translators, who are literally taxi drivers. They hop in the car and take you wherever you want to go. Now, the problem so far is that we have been explaining translation as a feature of the machine, as a feature of the car, when we should have been watching what the people at the wheel are doing. So we focused on working memory, we focused on the limitations of capacity and processing, but we never watched whether people were attending more or less, whether they were actually steering their behavior intentionally towards a certain purpose. I think it is time for us to focus on these things. I think that there's a lot of prediction in translation and interpreting that we have been ignoring. And there is an old-fashioned way of compartmentalizing meaning, grammatics, syntax, I don't know, was weiß ich, morphology and the like. And people really actually think that you process sounds, then morphology, then lexical, then syntax, then semantics, and then grammatics. Well, that is fine. You can also believe that the earth is flat, and some people do. But I think that is far removed. And even though it is a model, it has been taken as a representation of the reality of the mind and brain. So I think we actually need to try new things. There's a lot of things to do.
And within the new scheme of things, so to say that we may, if not overcome, at least understand that a given metaphor is not the only way to account for something, does not mean that we are relinquishing metaphors across the board. So whatever trends have emerged, let's say after the apogee of the computer metaphor of the mind, would you say what would you say are the metaphors that we are using now, or are we somehow circumventing metaphors and somehow just striking gold and describing the numen, the phenomenon itself as it is?
It is difficult to say. I'm not sure of what everybody else is saying or how they are describing the activities of translators and interpreters. I am not conscious of using a single metaphor. I don't have anything against that. But I'm sure it should be something quite active, quite translators and interpreters are actually doing very complex work, which at the same time is very down to earth. And they have a large number of mental constructions ad hoc for the task at hand. Um, and they, I don't know, maybe I would think of Indiana Jones to think of a translator or an interpreter, because I get this kind of feeling of adventure, the thrill that actually all interpreters know and many translators know as well, when they make a discovery along the way of their everyday work.
And I think many people will feel, many translators who may be watching this, they may feel identified with the feeling that the giant stone, you know, the stone ball is running behind you when the deadline is approaching, right?
Yeah, that's right.
You mentioned at some point, Ricardo, the different applied or practical aims of the field. Do you think that we have uh, that the you know the balance between theoretical and practical work in the field is well achieved, or do you think that this should be rebalanced somehow?
Well, the thing is that we are all familiar with Holmes' map that had theory on one side and empirical research on the other. But as you know, the motto says, um, there's nothing more practical than a good theory. A good theory is a research program. There can be no, I mean, if you have theory without practice, then it's not theory. Um, that is, I guess that there are several ways of describing that, but I cannot come up with any elegant one now. On the other hand, empirical research without theory is literally what headless chicken do.
Right.
They race around, in no particular direction. So we really need to strike a balance between theory and practice, but that actually means that we really need to improve our research practices. We really need to be aware that there is a theory sustaining what you do, and that what you do is actually trying to prove or disprove theory. And those who work in theory need to know that a theory is something that asks you to put data where your mouth is.
I really like the way you put that. So, in this beautiful picture that you are painting for us, which has taken us from, a cross-continental origin of the field in the 60s to Hollywood hotshot archaeologist to decapitated poultry somehow. That's where we are now. Let's think a little bit about the future. Please, humor me here, and let's imagine and do some perspective thinking here. What do you think are the main challenges that the field will face in upcoming years?
Well, we have many. Um, One of the challenges is to try and develop real quantitative research. Even though there seems to be a divide amongst us that I think there shouldn't exist between people doing qualitative and people doing quantitative. The fact is that quantitative has always been very modest in numbers. So it is true that we cannot generalize everything because there is no such thing as a homogeneous population of translators in the world. It is even difficult to get a sample, but we can still generalize things. The most famous applied science in the world is medicine, and they don't know how to define death, life, or health. Actually, they know too well. They have far too many definitions, which means that it's not that clear. But if they manage to become the most trusted science in our societies, if they manage to do really marvels, why shouldn't we? I mean, it is really true that I think we need to change strategies very often. Also, we are running a little bit behind of reality. We have now hybrid, we have always had hybrid tasks such as sight translation and interpreting, but we have now many more. We have many more, and we will have many more in the future because our civilization is turning back to oral. And we need to reconcile both oral and written forms because they're mixing up.
Right.
Computers are welcome, and they're here to stay. They're extremely helpful. We need tools. We are developing better and better tools to help translators. If we change our minds and we really know the difference between what computers can do, which is not thinking and not understanding, and what we can do, which is very often improved seriously with machines, then we can really help society. Our main challenge probably is to have an impact in society at large. I mean, we are, let's face it, quite irrelevant. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely, and yeah, I guess something that always concerns me is the extent to which we can actually be successful at reconciling the different traditions, paradigms, the biases that we all have, because no matter how pluralistic and cross-disciplinary you deem yourself to be, or you actually not struggle to become, there's always a certain path that you follow because you were trained in this compartmentalistic world of institutions, right? Um, do you think that we can realistically aspire to transcend the boundaries and really come up with a holistic approach that integrates all the good things that each single strand within the field has to offer? Or do you believe that something in the middle, with some level of compartmentalization is what will happen, as we move on in the next decades?
I don't think any of us, I mean, knowledge is ultimately individual. I don't think anyone can really aspire to get his view or her view as the one that everybody will embrace. That would not be probably science, that would be faith. I'm not very sure that that's the path we want to take. I'm quite convinced that my ideas, somebody else's ideas, your ideas will have an influence on some other people, and then our students will grow up to correct us and tell us that there were some things that we didn't get quite right. But that's what happened ever since Plato. So we shouldn't be really concerned about that. I don't think we're going to be able to end with such compartments. But I also see a tendency in translatological schools, I mean, those that are based on science, to become stronger, closer, and more prominent.
Right. And I share your view that we should not be dogmatic and that faith should not be our main guiding principle, but surely you do have faith in the MC2 lab, which you've recently established at University of Bologna in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
So to wrap up this interview, could you tell us a little bit about what the missions of this lab are and which role you see it playing in this developing trend that we are outlining here?
Let me start explaining the name, because I think that tells already some things about that. It's multilateral mediated communication and coordination. Multilateral because languages and dialects are just one thing, and the difference is social and political, but it is not a scientific difference. And we have learned, and it is part of our discipline, that there are changes within one language that are also that share a lot of things with translation and interpreting. Then it is mediated because in all these communication events, what is really significant is that there's somebody trying to get two other parties to understand each other or to better understand each other. That said, so we're studying translation, interpreting, sight translation. We are going to expand to other areas like post-editing and so on. We use a novel, not so novel really, you know that, approach within cognitive science. And we hope to contribute to the development of cognitive translation studies. There are several research centers in Belo Horizonte, in Germersheim, in Macau, in Kent, in Zurich, in Dublin, people in Austria, in Vienna. There are many people working, and we just would like to be one more guest in that party. We are certainly having a lot of fun by trying to build up a new view and, as I said before, trying to put data on our mouth.
That's fantastic, and it's great to see you in this party. We are all very excited to see what the MC2 lab is going to do when it takes the central stage in the dancing floor. So it's great to see that new options are being inaugurated. For a truly transnational development of the field. So that is really, really good. It's a very healthy section for the discipline at large, Ricardo. So thank you for that, and thank you too for your time. It was a pleasure to have you here, and we'll probably have further occasions to exchange ideas on the mental aspects of translation and interpretation.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'll be waiting for you here in June 2021, where we will have the third International Conference on Translation, Interpreting, and Cognition, the TREC Network Conference Series.
Fantastic. It'll be my pleasure. Thanks a lot, Ricardo.
Thank you.